This episode contains discussion of sexual violence, murder, and graphic descriptions that some listeners may find disturbing. If you need to step away at any point, please do. Okay, ready? Let's begin. August 1990, Gainesville, Florida. Late summer heat that sticks to your skin, the smell of cut grass and bug spray, move-in boxes scattered along sidewalks. Thousands of students are returning to the University of Florida. New roommates, new classes, new routines. Life feels, for the most part, ordinary. Except it isn't. A student, 18, wakes at night to the sound of someone in the apartment. She thinks it's the AC kicking on. She thinks it's the neighbor. She sits up and stares at the door because of a rumor she's heard earlier that day. Someone is killing young people in Gainesville. She and her friends take shifts sleeping. They leave a lightsaber of fear at the window doors, locked, mattresses pushed against doors, calls home that begin with, "Are you okay?" That is the mood of the town in those 4 days. I'm Maya Ellison. This is Still Unanswered. Today, we reconstruct the Gainesville Ripper case, Daniel Harold Danny Rolling, the 5 students murdered in August 1990, the crimes that preceded and followed them, the investigation that almost convicted the wrong man, and the courtroom moments where trauma, pathology, and spectacle collided. I'm joined by Dr. Lucas Herrera, forensic psychologist and consultant who works with survivors and correctional systems across the Southeast. Lucas, thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me, Maya. It's heavy material, but it's important stuff. Very important.
Before we go deep, a note on tone. We'll discuss violence that was intimate and brutal. We'll be careful with specifics, avoiding gratuitous detail so that the victims remain the center, not the perpetrator's mythology. Lucas, can we start with the immediate human frame? How a town like Gainesville reacts to that kind of concentrated fear?
Sure. So, when you're a college town young people living away from home for the first time, their sense of safety is partly built on routine, class schedules, campus lighting, the knowledge that if something goes wrong, you call campus police or your RA. Now, imagine 3 crime scenes appear over 48 hours, right at the start of the semester. People start to feel that those routines won't protect them. Anxiety spreads contagiously. Physical reactions, sleep disturbance, hypervigilance, mirror what survivors of trauma feel after the fact. But the whole community is in it together, so the fear becomes civic.
Right, and I think that's why students were taking turns, sleeping, moving back home, carrying bats and pepper spray, right? Panic wasn't just personal. It affected class attendance, enrollment, mental health services, everything. Okay, let's go back a step. Who was Danny Rolling before Gainesville? Because the story doesn't start in Florida.
Danny Rolling was born in Shreveport, Louisiana in 1954. His childhood, by most accounts, was marked by severe, chronic abuse, physical and emotional, from his father. He recounts, and others corroborate, extreme punishments, belittling language, and even an episode where the family dog was beaten to death. That kind of early environment shapes attachment, self-image, and, crucially, it teaches that violence is an acceptable means to control or humiliate others. But, important caveat, abuse doesn't equate to inevitability. Many people survive horrific childhoods without becoming violent killers. In Danny's case, other risk factors accumulated: early criminality, sexual deviance, substance use, unstable relationships, and later, an escalation into more violent acts.
You said escalation. There are some grim incidents before Gainesville. an attempted patricide in May 1990, and the triple murders in Shreveport in November 1989. The Grissom family murders, right?
Yes, November 4, 1989, Tom Grissom, his daughter Julie, and Julie's son Sean were killed in their home in Shreveport. Julie's body, in particular, was sexually mutilated and posed in ways that later echoed the Gainesville crime scenes. At the time, the linkage wasn't obvious to police in Florida, but the similarities would later matter. Then, in May 1990, Danny shot his father, James Rowling, twice. James survived, but with severe injuries. After that, Danny fled Louisiana. That flight pattern, abuse, burglary, sexual offenses, escalating violence, flight, fits a profile of someone moving towards serial offending.
It's chilling to hear that build. There's also a Sarasota victim who survived an assault in August 1990, weeks before Gainesville. Janet Frake, she was assaulted, but not killed, and later DNA linked Rowling to that crime. So he was already active in Florida.
Right, and that matters because it shows the pattern: home invasion, binding and gagging, sexual assault, sometimes murder. The presence of a non-fatal assault gives us a rare surviving account of his methods and helps forensic linkage with DNA.
Okay, let's step into the Gainesville days, the murders themselves. There were 5 victims across 4 days: Sonja Larson and Christina Powell, August 24th, Christa Hoyt around August 25th, 26th, and then Manuel Taboada and Tracy Paules on August 27th. Lucas, I want to emphasize, we'll avoid lurid detail, but we need to be precise about sequence and effect. Can you describe, clinically, what serial violent acts like these tell investigators about motive and control?
Clinical interpretation must be cautious, but we can infer some patterns. The early Gainesville scenes showed planning entry at night, stalking behavior, binding victims, sexual assault, post-mortem staging. That suggests ritualized behavior and an attempt to exert total control over life, over death, over the narrative left behind. Rituals can also be a way for offenders to process their own fantasies, to replay them. The later crime, the Mad and Tracy apartment, showed more resistance and less meticulous staging. That could indicate increased pressure on the offender, time constraints, risk of detection, or emotional escalation when plans go awry. Those differences can reflect both practical circumstances and psychological shifts in the offender's state of mind during the spree.
The staging part it invites a media narrative, doesn't it? People start to call him a ripper, nicknames that evoke mythology. The press did that a lot, Gainesville Ripper, and rumors exploded. Decapitations on every victim, satanic cults, campus conspiracies. In truth, only Christa Hoyt was decapitated. But the rumor mill did more than misinform. It stoked fear. Lucas, what effect does that kind of sensational media coverage have on both the investigation and the community?
Sensational coverage can be double-edged. On one hand, public attention can generate tips and keep pressure on investigators. On the other, it can distort perceptions, creating legends that change witness testimony, encourage copycats, and lead law enforcement to chase high-profile theories rather than evidence. In Gainesville, the hyperbole contributed to mass panic and may have tightened the timeline for police to make an arrest, which increases the risk of mistakes. And, this is crucial, the first wrong man targeted by police and media was a student named Edward Humphrey.
Yes. We have to talk about Humphrey because his story is a tragic byproduct of this investigation. He was a 19-year-old UF student with a history of manic episodes, bipolar disorder, and he lived near some of the victims. Police and media focused on him, released mugshots, and set bail at $1 million for an unrelated assault. He spent over a year in jail before being cleared of any link to the murders. Lucas, from a forensic perspective, what went wrong there?
A few converging failures. First, when the public is terrified, there's immense pressure on law enforcement to identify and arrest a suspect fast. That pressure can produce confirmation bias. Small, ambiguous clues are overweighted. Second, Humphrey's psychiatric instability and odd behavior made him an easy target in the public imagination. Dangerous identifications are often drawn to those who look or act different. Third, the media's appetite for a narrative simplified the nuance of suspect into villain in the court of public opinion. The ethical failure is that mental illness and eccentricity were treated as guilt proxies rather than red flags needing careful, unbiased investigation. Finally, the focus on Humphrey diverted resources and attention away from other viable leads, something that, in a fast-moving case, can be catastrophic.
And Humphrey paid a real price. He lost over a year of his life behind bars and carried that stigma long after. His case becomes one of the episode's recurring, still unanswered threads. How did community fear and media framing cause collateral damage? Okay, so how did investigators eventually catch Danny Rolling?
The break came from a combination of luck, forensic linkage, and a tip. Rolling was arrested after an armed robbery at a Winn-Dixie in Ocala on September 7, 1990. That brought him into custody outside Gainesville. Meanwhile, investigators had discovered a campsite he used in the woods near UF Tools, a cassette recorder with some disturbing recordings, items possibly stolen from victims. Forensic work tied his blood type and later DNA evidence to the Gainesville scenes and to the earlier Shreveport murders. A woman in Shreveport who had known, or at least met Rolling, provided a tip linking him to the Grissom case. Eventually, the accumulation of physical evidence and that tip converged, and Rolling was identified as the primary suspect.
There's an almost cinematic irony. The man who had been living in the brush near campus, recording audio diaries, got arrested because he committed a clumsy, visible robbery. It wasn't one of the murders that led to him. It was a grocery store robbery. Once arrested and connected, we're in the murky territory of motive and mind. Rolling claimed an alternate personality, Gemini, like a character from The Exorcist III. He wanted to be a superstar killer. Lucas, what's your take on Gemini? Authentic mental illness or constructed persona?
This is where clinical nuance matters. The presence of a claimed alternate personality could represent true dissociative pathology, but such disorders are rare and have strict diagnostic criteria. In Rolling's case, evaluators found severe personality pathology and significant trauma history. At least one psychiatrist suggested multiplicity. Others thought Rolling lacked psychosis and knew right from wrong, making him legally responsible. Given Rolling's appetite for attention and his later collaboration with a writer to craft his story, there's strong reason to view Gemini at least partly as a performative defense, a narrative designed to deflect blame and gain notoriety. That said, performative doesn't preclude real dissociation. Trauma can produce fragmented identity experiences. The challenge is disentangling what's sincere from what's strategic.
You mentioned his collaboration with Sondra London. There's an ethical knot there. Rolling helped shape his own public narrative, which fed public fascination and the killer brand he wanted. That intersects with the larger question: when journalists and writers engage with killers, do they inadvertently grant the fame those killers crave? Lucas?
They can. There's a real risk that access journalism and true crime books amplify a killer's sense of immortality. For people who commit crimes partly for notoriety, media attention is reward. Ethically, storytellers must center victims in context, avoid sensationalized portraits, and be transparent about the harms of amplifying perpetrators' voices. That's hard, because startling confessions sell books and clicks. But the social duty is to weigh the costs.
Agreed. Let's turn to the courtroom. Rowling eventually pleaded guilty in February 1994. Surprising to many, after years of investigating and preparing for trial. He pled guilty to the 5 Gainesville murders, and during the penalty phase, the jury recommended death. His mother testified about the abuse he suffered. How did the defense try to present Rowling's life as mitigation, and how did the prosecution counter?
The defense emphasized severe childhood abuse, unstable family dynamics, and psychological disturbance. They argued that Rowling's capacity for self-control and empathy had been compromised by long-term trauma. The prosecution focused on the planning, the deliberate stalking, the conscious steps like breaking into apartments, binding victims, and staging scenes, which they argued showed understanding and intentionality. In capital cases, that tension, mitigation versus aggravation, is where juries decide whether the person is irredeemable. In Rowling's case, the jury sided with the state, citing the extreme cruelty and danger to society.
He was executed in October 2006. Witnesses reported he sang a hymn he'd written in the execution chamber. It's a strange, chilling end. A man who sought celebrity dies in a state ritual with limited statement, and yet his crimes continue to echo. After the execution, questions remained. Did Rowling have more victims? Did he truly, deep down, believe himself to be Gemini? And for the city of Gainesville, what persisted?
The unanswered question of additional victims is plausible. Rowling had a history of travel, burglary, sexual assault across state lines, and an admitted history of rape before Gainesville. The Grissom murders in Shreveport were eventually linked to him, and at least one other non-fatal sexual assault was tied by DNA. But given the transient nature of many cold cases and limited databases at the time, it's likely, though not provable, that more crimes committed by him remain unattributed. It's part of why modern cold case units continue to retest old evidence with DNA. As for Gemini, I think we may never fully know. He used culture and narrative to his advantage. Whether that mask was inhabited or donned when convenient, it became part of the myth he wanted. It's part of why modern cold case units continue to retest old evidence with DNA. As for Gemini, I think we may never fully know.
And the human cost, the families, the survivors, the community. How did Gainesville carry this forward?
There are memorials. The graffiti wall on 34th Street includes a panel for the victims that reads, "Remember 1990." Survivors and students reported long-term effects, permanent hypervigilance, changed life choices, a general distrust of solitude. Institutions implemented changes, better campus lighting, more emergency phones, enhanced police presence, improved housing security. It wasn't just physical infrastructure, it was a cultural shift in how students thought about personal safety. That kind of change is protective, but it also marks a loss of innocence for a generation.
Let's circle back to some of the still unanswered questions that haunt this case, because that's where our show lives. First, nature versus nurture. The childhood abuse Rowling experienced was devastating, but many with worse childhoods don't become killers. So what made him different?
There's no single answer. In dynamic terms, 3 domains matter: predisposition, environmental triggers, and opportunities. Predisposition could be temperament, impulsivity, neurobiological vulnerabilities. The environment, the chronic, violent abuse, sculpts the social learning. Then there are catalysts, substance use, adulthood stressors, loss, rejection. In Rowling's case, the attempted patricide and the subsequent flight were explicit accelerants. Plus, his criminal career provided the skill set, the breaking and entering, surveillance, willingness to use weapons that made violent escalation possible. It's the intersectionality of factors that creates risk, not any single one.
Second big question. Did the investigation and media permanently harm an innocent man, Edward Humphrey? And what does that say about handling suspects with mental illness?
It says we need better forensic triage and media ethics. When a case is high pressure, police need neutral processes, blind reviews of evidence, independent oversight, and a reluctance to leak mugshots or theories without proper context. The media needs guidelines for reporting on suspects with psychiatric diagnoses to avoid dehumanizing or presuming guilt. Legal systems must also ensure bail amounts and pretrial detention don't function as punishments before guilt is established. Humphrey's situation was a cautionary tale that still matters.
Third, motive and the desire for superstar status. Rowling explicitly wanted fame. He collaborated on books. He modeled himself on earlier serial killers. Do we have any moral responsibility as storytellers to avoid fueling that hunger?
Yes, storytellers carry responsibility. We can tell stories that are rigorous, victim-centered, and contextualized, showing the social harms of fame-seeking criminals. We can avoid sensational photos, refrain from repeating manifestos, and instead use our platforms to amplify victim voices, systemic failures, and prevention. That doesn't mean sanitizing facts. It means framing them responsibly.
Fourth, the possibility of additional victims. Given today's DNA technology, is there hope for closure in related cold cases?
There's real hope. Genetic genealogy and improved databases have solved cold cases previously thought impossible. If preserved evidence exists, semen, blood, saliva, modern techniques may link those scenes to Rowling or to other perpetrators. The complicating factor is preservation. How well was evidence collected and stored 30 years ago? That varies. But advances make it more possible than ever to answer these questions.
Lucas, I want to pause and remind listeners, the people we're naming, Sonja Larson, Christina Powell, Christa Hoyt, Tracy Paules, Manuel Taboada, and the Grissams in Louisiana, were full lives with friendships, futures, and daily routines interrupted by someone who chose to take them. As a host, I try, constantly, to return the center to them. Can you speak to why that matters in both psychology and public ethics?
Centering victims matters because it humanizes what would otherwise become abstract sensationalism. Psychologically, focusing on victims helps communities process grief and directs resources to survivors. Ethically, it prevents the narrative from becoming a shrine to perpetrators. We remember to ask, who needed help? Where were the system failures? How can we prevent another tragedy? Those are useful questions. Celebrity for criminals is harmful. Restorative focus on victims serves public health.
The media fixation is hard to resist. True. Rowling's case even inspired elements of pop culture, like Scream. It's an example of how real horror gets repackaged into entertainment. That's another ethical knot. Consumption of true crime can educate, but it can also inadvertently celebrate.
Exactly. As listeners, it's worth asking what we do with these stories. Do we learn and advocate for better policies, campus safety, mental health access, trauma-informed policing? Or do we merely indulge the thrill? The best outcome would be the former.
Before we wrap up, I want to address the families and survivors, because this is for them as much as for our curious audience. Some readers, listeners, and even reporters maintain contact with families or respect boundaries. Others don't. What have you seen in your work, Lucas, that helps survivors when cases like this rise again in the public eye?
Boundaries and agency. Survivors often have to relive trauma when cases are publicized, anniversaries, new documentaries, or renewed media interest. Helpful practices include consulting families before releasing graphic details, offering mental health resources when doing interviews, and giving survivors control over how their loved ones are portrayed. Also, creating spaces for quiet remembrance, memorials, community vigils can be healing. The media and academics should not assume families want attention. They may prefer privacy and dignity.
That's an important reminder. Okay, final segment. The show is called Still Unanswered for a reason. What are the threads that remain unresolved in the Gainesville case? And where should future investigators, journalists, or grassroots researchers focus their energy?
Several things. 1. Continuing to test preserved evidence from nearby cold cases with modern DNA methods. 2. Archival research and interviews that could identify patterns of Rowling's travel and unlinked crimes. He moved through multiple states. 3. Re-examining investigative failures, like the Humphrey episode, to institutionalize better practices around mental health suspects and to prevent scapegoating. 4. Rigorous study of media impacts on cases and ethical guidelines for reporting. And finally, more resources for survivors, long after the headlines fade. Closure is often partial, and communities need ongoing support.
And for listeners, if you work with archives, know family members of victims, or have tips about cold cases in the Southeast from the late 80s and early 90s, contact local law enforcement or cold case units. Sometimes an old lead, a photograph, a name in a journal can be the hinge that opens a door. Lucas, any final clinical reflections you want to share?
This case is a stark reminder that trauma begets complexity. When we study perpetrators, we must balance explanation with accountability. Trauma can inform, but it doesn't excuse. And as a society, if we want to reduce violent crime, we invest in early interventions, child welfare, mental health supports, substance use treatment. Prevention requires structural commitment, not just after-the-fact dissection.
Thank you. To close, the 5 Gainesville students: Sonja Larson, Christina Powell, Christa Hoyt, Tracy Paules, and Manuel Taboada. Remember them as people, not part of a legend. There are no tidy answers here. We have patterns and plausible explanations, but questions remain. Did he have more victims? Was Gemini real or performance? How many lives were upended by panic and misdirected suspicion? Those are the threads we'll keep pulling. If this episode felt heavy, it's because it is. True crime is an invitation to examine how systems fail and how communities heal, or don't. We owe the victims a clear, careful reckoning, not a glamorized myth. Lucas, thank you again for being here. Your insight helps keep this a forum for learning instead of spectacle.
Thank you, Maya. And thank you to listeners for engaging with this difficult story thoughtfully. It matters.
If you need resources after this episode, check our show notes for links to survivor support organizations and crisis hotlines. If you have tips related to this case, reach out to the respective law enforcement cold case units. Do it through official channels. We will be careful with anything we receive. Next week, we'll continue our series on unsolved and partially solved crimes in college towns, stories that changed policy and still echo in dorm hallways. Until then, I'm Maya Ellison, and this is Still Unanswered. Remember the names. Honor the lives. Don't let the mythology win. Good night.